This is a classic 3AC carburetor. Black thing is a choke. This is for the secondary throttle. Choke breaker or choke. Something to do with the choke. This pin's the choke open. Pushing that down. Throttle positioner. This hole here is where the gas line hooks up. This is the famous AAP, the diaphragm in here. If it goes bad, we'll squirt gas out here. The fuel cut solenoid. The carburetor is the 2-wire on the back of the carb. The single wire on the driver's side. Some of the cars, they're reversed, like the earlier 83s. Single wire would go on the back, double on the side. Depends on what your car is. Anyway, I thought we'd take it apart. It's this is 15340 is the tag. I don't think this car's ever been taken apart. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 screws holding the top on. Need to disconnect a few items, like disconnect that clip there and pop this free. Need to disconnect, pull the little thing out of there and disconnect this, or disconnect it down here a little further. And I think that's everything needs to be disconnected to pull the top off. So disconnect that vacuum line. That's your the accelerator pump. Take these apart, there's these little clips and things. The screw here gets this type of clip. The screw here gets this thing on it. The screw gets a wire holder. This one gets a wire holder, and you need to take this 12mm off to get that screw out. It's a shoulder screw. I'd already disconnected this end. There was a, it goes on this, there's a spring that goes on here, and a little clip, and there's a little plastic thing that goes in there that holds that in place. It was missing on this carb. That's what the little clip looks like. Move the one for there, and the one for this. Pop that one loose. Now I should be able to pull the top off the carburetor. My problem is these wires are still hanging on, so when I pull the top off, the red wire is going to come free with this, but these solenoids are going to be holding the wire, so I'm going to get the solenoids out. Sometimes I think it's easier just to cut the wires, all but the red one. Just cut them off and then put some splice connectors on them, and when you put them back together, it makes it a lot easier getting them off and on. When I slipped the screwdriver right in here and pried it up, broke the gasket free. When I take it off, I want to be kind of careful taking it off, because there is one thing in there that's spring loaded. It's not much of a spring, but I want to keep an eye on parts as I take the top off, make sure nothing falls out. So I'd show you, this is where that aluminum piston was in the spring. This is where it should go before it popped out of there. And you know, the spring goes in this hole. Pulled this solenoid out of the side of the carb. This is the single wire for this particular carb. There's a little O-ring goes on the end. Comes in a rebuild kit. And the way to test it is to touch this on the positive terminal of your battery and touch the body of this on the negative. And if it clicks, it's working properly. If it doesn't click, sometimes you can wrap them on something, tap them with a hammer lightly and get them working again. And if they don't click, then they're no good. This is a solenoid. It's a 2-wire. Came out of the back of the carb right there. See what it looks like. Test it. There's 2 wires. You can't see the other end, but there's 2 wires. You touch one on positive, one on negative of the battery, and it should click. I loosened up these screws. This is the primary. There's a gasket on the bottom. It's still stuck in there. It needs to be replaced. This is the secondary. Kind of see how long the screws have to be. This carburetor has been taken apart before. This is a buggered up screw. I loosen that one up and taking that brass screw out and taking that brass screw out. There's a ball bearing down in there. It has to come out, small ball bearing. And I have this screw loose, and I'm going to pull it out of there. Okay, this is the type of screw, brass screw that came out of this hole right here. A little spring, and that shaped screw that was in this hole right here, and that plug, that ball bearing, they're in that hole right there. Okay, now down inside that hole, the accelerator pump hole, down at the bottom, there's a G-clip, a little spring-loaded G-clip in there. And I'm going to twist that out with a needle nose pliers, and there's a ball bearing underneath it. Okay, use a 9mm to get this off. Deep dish socket, deep socket I should say. That looks like there's a screw in the bottom of it. You can take out. There's a little tiny hole in it. It needs to be cleaned out. Okay, next thing I'm going to take off is these 2 bolts and this nut to get this throttle positioner assembly out of the way, and that way I can get out these 2 nut or plugs so I can pull the 2 jets out of the carburetor. Okay, I pulled the throttle positioner off with 2 bolts, 10mm. And that frees up that spring. I loosen up this nut, which is a 10mm. There's a lock washer underneath it. Takes this thing off. That comes off, and there's a fine washer. It goes right there. And the spring. I can get these 2 plugs off. Alright, 14mm. Through those 2 plugs. Just have a little copper washer on them. The washer's kind of stuck on there anyway. Now I can get down in there to get at these 2 jets with a screwdriver I put in through here. Okay, I stuck the screwdriver in the hole. Get at the jets, which were in that hole there. These are the two jets. The primary is marked 103, the secondary 159. 103 is pretty common. 101 is also another very common one. And the 159, I don't remember the numbers on those. What was considered high, I'd have to look. Okay, now let's take off the 3 screws that hold this AP on and see how that thing looks in there. Okay, get the screws loose. Spring. See relatively how long it is. It's not broken. Not very flexible anymore. Kind of stiff, but it would still work, I imagine. Okay, the next things we're going to remove, we'll take those 2 screws off, pull this off, we'll take the spring off, we'll disconnect right there, a little clip, take the spring off, take that spring off, and get that thing out of there. And then we'll take this nut off, it looks like a 12 millimeter, and pull all this off. Okay. Put that screw all the way out. That's what it looks like. That's a black thing is a washer spacer, like a gasket. Seals for the vacuum coming out of the carburetor. See the relative length of the screws. And, get that spring out of there. Now I'll get that off. Alright, get this 12 millimeter loose. And there's a lock washer underneath it. Takes that thing off. And this should come off of there. Coming off very easy. Note that there's a super thin washer, and then there's this resin washer, super thin washer there. Yeah, I'll have to put some effort into it here. Got it off now. This is kind of what it looks like. This piece right here slips inside here.
Early career in Rome between 1706 and 1710. He made music there, worked with people like Arcangelo.
And like I showed earlier here, there's this resin washer, spacer, and a very thin washer. Okay, now we can take the base off the carb. 4 screws have to come off. Okay, long Phillips screw, long Phillips, lock washer, get that lock washer out of there, and then you have these 2 screws. Well, this is just a common screwdriver on this end of the carburetor. This is where the throttle mechanisms all hook up. The rear of the carburetor. This is the front of the carburetor. And this screw has a hole in it. And we should be able to knock that thing free. There you have the base of the carburetor. The gasket still attached. And this is the base that the carburetor mounts on. Your vacuum ports. And this one, some models don't have this one right here. It picks up this vacuum off of the line that goes to the distributor on other cars. This is the one that attaches to the base of the carburetor. I mean the base of the air filter housing. There's another washer right there. That was on the front side. So there are two washers there. No need to take this off or mess with it as long as your flappers are working properly. You know, not excessively loose. It feels snug when I wiggle them up and down. In good shape. This is the throttle screw for the your idle. And the bottom plug, this is the one that's set at the factory. There's a screw in there. You can barely see where it comes out down there. Right at the center of that, just above, there's a little bump that sticks out. Right about there. And that's set at the factory for idle. But sometimes you can drill that plug out, and then you'll be able to turn the screw. It's just your typical screw that has a spring in it, like this one. All right, it's all apart. Now I gotta clean everything up. See, that thing is full of crud, and let it soak in some carb cleaner. And there's all the parts over there. And here's the float, the pin that holds that in. It's your accelerator pump, and it comes off by just working this rubber boot off, and it'll come out of there. You gotta take that screw off, get this plunger out. There's a spring behind it, and get that thing so it's working again. It's frozen. Alright, I put the main body of the carb and the base in there. That's some nasty stuff. I've had that can for quite a few years, and I don't think there's anything that smells worse than that stuff. You get one little speck of it on you and it stinks up the whole everything. Okay, back to this aluminum piston. Forgot to show the big ball bearing goes in at the bottom. You can see the difference in size between it and the smallers. There's like 3 small ones in the carburetor and the one big one. And the big one goes below the spring, below that piston. Yeah, this is the needle seat, and you can see that little filter on the end has got a hole in it, so it's no good. Probably really don't need that filter if you change your fuel filter often. When you get a new kit, they give you a new one of these in the kit. And this piece, after I heated up the aluminum, I was able to grab that with a pair of pliers and pull it out of there. The spring is comparable there. And then this is your accelerator pump piston. This is leather right here, and it's all hard, so it wasn't going to work at all. Sometimes you can soak those things in oil, loosen them up. The kits come with new plungers, so anyway, that's about it. I got it soaking out there in that nasty chemical solution, the body of the carb, and when it's done I'll spray that off with water. I'll probably put on my rain gear because you get one speck of that stinky stuff on you and it smell it for days. And then after I spray it off with water, I'll bring it in and blow it out with air and set it on the stove and let it dry. I'm not going to dip this in that chemical. I think I'm just going to clean it up. There's a little jet right here. It needs to be cleaned out. I'll make sure I can blow air through it. And I did get that pin out that holds the float in took some work. I had to heat it up and work it back and forth, back and forth. It was really stuck in there. Okay, after dipping in that solution and washing it off with water hose, air drying it, blowing it out with compressed air. Clean both of them up. I just got to do the top. Probably just use regular canned carburetor cleaner or brake cleaner, whatever I've got around here. I put all the small parts, brass parts, ball bearings, springs, everything is coated with that gunk from the gas, old gas, and then I sprayed it with some carb cleaner. It's the typical carbon choke cleaner, stinky stuff. Cap on it. It's going to sit for a while. Okay, I'm going to take those two parts, the primary and the secondary. Go inside the throttle. I'm going to spray some carb cleaner in those and swish them around. Let them soak for a while too. Alright, I dumped out the parts. Held those out because they have little holes in them. I'm going to make sure all those holes are clean. And this part here, there's a screw on the bottom you can take off. Clean it out. It has some real tiny holes at the top. Of course, these are your jets. Make sure those are clear. And that'll be it for cleaning. Put all the small parts in this container here so you won't lose them. Those are still working on soaking. Alright, I'm working on these. You can see there's little tiny holes at the top. There's, like 6 of them. Then down here at the base of that brass fitting, there's 4 holes. What I found works good is you just take some springs. They usually have really thin wire and they're pretty stiff. And unravel them and use those wires to work into those holes. So you want to make sure you clean those up. 4 holes on the bottom here and then 6 holes on the top. And then we'll blow that one out. Also, there's a little hole right there too. And then on this piece, there's a little hole there at the top right. And I'm going to clean these up and find any holes that are in the bottom. Should be some down there on the bottom. Okay, this is the secondary. And there's 6 holes at the top on the big one. 4 holes at the bottom of the big one. And that little tube has a hole right in the end of it. And then you gotta clean out that one. And I'm not sure what that is. Anyway, there's that one I cleaned out. And looks like there might be one up there. Work on that. Okay, that was a little tiny hole there. Clean that one out. This wire is .014 diameter. I unscrewed the screw off the end of that. There's a little hole in that screw. Clean that out. One spot that's easy to miss is there's a little hole right here. A little brass thing sticking out that goes down through. You want to make sure you clean out that little thing too. I'm not sure what exactly it is, but I took the screws off to hold the viewing port. There's a piece of glass. Usually will just pop right out. It's kind of stuck in there. Get it out of there, clean her up. There's a new O-ring that goes on there. It'll come with the kit. Okay, I got the O-ring out. Piece of glass. Clean that up. And really, it's pretty much ready to go back together. I just need to get a kit. Okay, to start putting this thing back together, the first things to put in is the jets. Make sure the big hole jet goes on that side. The small hole jet, in this case it's a 103, will go on this side. You reach inside there, it actually goes down inside there. Right below my finger there, and right below my finger over here. I want to reach in with a screwdriver and screw those in. Find a screwdriver, it'll fit on, the screw will fit on nice and tight, then you can stick it in the hole and screw it in. After I put the jets in, I mark on the side of the carb 2 places on each. That's a 103 and a 159 hole size. You can see the one jet there, and there's the other one on the right. Now I put this spring-loaded part. It goes right down here. And that hole right there. It's a 9mm deep extension, deep socket to get it in there. Okay, get that installed now. On the left there, we drop a small ball bearing in that hole and put the cap screw over the top of it, brass cap screw. Okay, lower left there, you see that brass screw. Just to the left of that hole is where I drop the small ball bearing in there and put that cap screw in there. On this hole here, gets a small spring, small ball bearing first, small spring, and the brass screw looks like that, follows the spring in. Spring is about 1/2 inch. 2 springs stuck together there. I have to unstuck them. Okay, there's the spring. It's about a little over 1/2 inch long. Okay, we got that top screw in, brass screw. That was a small ball bearing followed by about a little over 1/2 inch long spring, and then the screw with the little protrusion on the end of it. Okay, now I have this brass screw that goes in that hole right there. Screw it down till it's snug. Now the top hole, the big hole right here, I get a small ball bearing in the bottom, and then there's a G-clip that follows it. That's the G-clip. It's kind of delicate. I made this G-clip installer because I always have a hard time getting those G-clips in. I actually put the G-clip in the end of that thing, and then I used the end of that end of the drill bit to push it. So I put that in, set it right in place where it needs to go, push the drill bit down there, and it pushes that G-clip right into the spot without wrecking it. I tried it with needle nose pliers and numerous other things, and you end up wrecking them, and those clips are kind of hard to come by. Yeah, I've got the G-clip in there. It sets down right over that boss that's sticking up down there. Where I put that small ball bearing in the hole. Now I can just take this drill bit and push it in. And it's in there. I don't know if you can see it. Alright, next thing to go in is the gasket. It's for the secondary, and somewhere laying here is the gasket for the primary. This is the secondary. So one screw is longer on one side. Drop that down in there. This is the primary. Screws are the same length. Drop that in there and get it screwed in. This is a good time to put this on so you don't forget about it later. It's easy to forget to put that little rubber thing on there. We're going to hold off on this hole. This is the hole that takes the big ball bearing and the spring and the aluminum piston. But since it kind of dangles free, we won't put that in until we get ready to put the top on. So what's left to do on this, on the inside, pretty much everything's in. Attach the base to it. I think we'll do that next. Well, that's probably not necessary. I usually center punch that and drill out that plug, so I have the option of adjusting that screw. Pre-drilled it with a smaller drill bit first. Now it takes the biggest bit, about 5/16 to get it out. Okay, the plug is out. Now what I like to do is turn the screw down till it's tight, but I count the revolutions exactly, like 1 1/4, 1 1/8, and then I mark it on the, scratch it on the metal there so I know what the original was. Okay, I put a mark right there, center punch, and I center punch the side of the screw that lines up. Now I'm going to screw it down to, not tight, just so it bottoms out. I'm going to count exactly the revolutions. The gasket, the base will go on there, and you have these 4 screws. Make sure you get the one with the hole in it that goes on the front side of the carburetor, which is the side that has the window in it, hole. And don't forget, there's 2 big screws that go in the middle, 2 smaller ones diameter on the outside, and they have lock washers on them. Got 2 bigger one on that one. Also, before you put the base on, there's a small thin washer that goes on here. You want to put that on first because it sits right in this recess and you can't get that washer on after it's installed. So put the washer on there first. Very thin one. Okay, base is installed. See how that washer in there, it only can't get it on after the fact. Okay, the plugs, the front bottom here, there's new washers, usually come with a kit. The old ones are copper, which are probably fine, but I'll put the new ones in it. 2 of them, number 14s. Alright, there's a new O-ring that goes in there before you put the glass in. Viewing window, I don't know, you know, eyes aren't good enough, but you're supposed to be able to see the level of the gas in there. I've never been able to see it. I can't make anything out with a flashlight or whatever. But it's there. Some people seem to be able to see it. And those 2 screws. Okay, this is the AAP. It's not a new one. I'm reusing the old one because I don't have a new one. I used the one that was in the kit was used for another carburetor. Anyway, you got the brass side up, and there's the, at least it looks brassy. It only go one way. Spring in there. Gasket over the top of it. That 3 screws. Okay, AAP installed, window and the 2 plugs. Now we're going to put the throttle positioner stuff on. You got spring, your thin washer should go down to the spring. That goes on there. Lock washer with a nut that follows it. Actually, this thing's got to go on there. After you get that on there, then this goes on. Slotted, so it can only go one way. And then we put the lock washer and nut on. Make sure you have the throttle rotated around so that that slot is angling at the right direction. And you can spin the throttle butterfly all the way around. It's in the wrong spot. Anyway, this is how it's supposed to be hooked up, like that. I'm going to finish hooking it up. I've got to put the spring in. Up here as you're installing that piece. That's what she looks like when she's installed. And now we're going to install the vacuum thing for the secondary throttle. The little washer goes right there. And this sets in over it with 2 screws. Hold it on. And then take this and snap it in that. And on the other side there, you put the little clip, little thin little wire clip on the end. See the little wire clip installed on the end of that thing. Also, going back to this side, don't forget the little wire clip right there, right in the center of the picture, on the end of that. Okay, wire clip is installed. Hopefully this focuses enough where you can see it. Okay, now for the throttle setup, there's a thin, very thin washer. It goes on first. Oops, that's a little too small. Okay. Thin washer. That drops on first. Doesn't hurt to give a little oil on these things. Now we're going to put this on with this thing in the middle of it. Okay, this is the way this piece orientates. Goes inside there, and this drops down over that shaft. After you put the thin metal washer on, which is right there, and you want to slide this plastic piece over. Then with this orientated and slid in there, that drops down over it. Okay, I got that stuff slid over the shaft. Now we want to put this on. Why not? There's a little bump right there on the left. It goes in one of those slots, and then lock washer it with a 12mm nut. After you get it installed, I'm going to hook that spring up, and then that spring right there goes in that slide spot there in the bottom center, and then up to the mounting spot. This is the fuel cut. There's a little O-ring that goes on the end. This old one is hard. Plus, I hooked wires up to the battery and it didn't click. So all I can do is try tapping it on it and cleaning out those holes, and then retest it. Maybe squirt some penetrating oil in there if it's froze up. See if I can get it to click. I got a little spark at the end, so looks like it might work. But if it doesn't, I'll just have to replace it. Okay, I heated it up with the propane torch a little bit, and then squirted penetrating oil on there. and then tapped it, and eventually it freed up. And now when I touch the two terminals on the battery, it clicks. So it's working. Okay, I put some blades on the end, make it easier to hook it up. Do the same with the other one, the single wire solenoid. Before installing, don't forget to put a gasket on it. And for this particular car, it's going in 1983, so it's going to go on this one. I also need to put the O-ring on the end. Okay, I installed the O-ring. I measured it. It's approximately 0.036 diameter and approximately 0.138 ID, which comes out to like a 3.5 millimeter to approximately a 0.8 millimeter cross-section diameter. Okay, the solenoid's installed. Gonna come a little short on this end to reach, so I'll probably have to put an extension. Okay, this is a single wire solenoid, and I touched the body on the negative terminal and the other end on the positive, and it clicks. I installed the new O-ring. Incidentally, those O-rings, there's a place called applerubber.com where you can get the metric. Look for the metric one that's 3.5 ID by about, I think it was 0.8 or 0.9 cross section. And you can buy them. I haven't tried yet. I don't know how many I'd have to buy to get them to send me. I don't think they'd send me just two. Anyway, and there's a gasket. Don't forget to put the gasket on. Now in this particular, it's going to go in the rear here. Part of the, because it's a 1983 and that's where it's required to go. Remember, the later models, 87, 88, check them because sometimes the 2 wire is required. The 1 wire would be over here instead of the 2. Okay, there it's installed with the clip over it to hold the wire. Okay, next thing we're going to install is that spring, then the plunger goes in over the top of it, and then the screw with the hold down. It goes in that hole right in the center of the picture there. Okay, it's installed. It just goes up and down just a little bit. Put a little drop of 3-in-1 oil on it just to get it loosened up, make sure it's free. Okay, this is the boot for the accelerator pump shaft. Goes inside that hole there. I'll put that in next. Okay, the boot's installed. Let's see what it looks like on the other side. Okay, these are the parts for the needle seat. In the needle itself, you need to put this little spring, very small spring inside this, and then this follows it with this end going in, the small end, and then this little clip goes on the end to hold it all together. So it doesn't focus very close, but you can see a little plunger in the top. Spring goes in first, plunger over the top, spring over the top that holds it all together. Okay, now we're going to screw in the needle seat, the gasket on it. It goes in this hole right here. Use a big screwdriver so you can get it pretty tight. I should mention that there's usually a little filter that goes over the end of this, but I don't have any spare ones, and the one that came out of this car was damaged, had a hole in it, so it was useless anyway. So as long as you get a good fuel filter in the car, you shouldn't have to worry too much about that. So I'm gonna go ahead and install it without one. Okay, now we're gonna put the float in and adjust it. You can see that measurement on the left It's 9/32, which is 0.28 between the casting and the float. That's not including the gasket. So I'm going to get that set up now. You have to bend the tab in order to make it work out alright. There's a tab on the where it says number 2 there on the right. It says to adjust, bend, float tab until you get that proper gap. And I'm going to use a 0.28 9/32 drill bit. Set it on here and until I get it adjusted right. We take our needle and drop it in the hole there for the needle seat, and then I can put the float on. These are the different types of needles. The needle itself is the same, but the spring is a different length. You can see that the front spring is only 0.2 approximately, just a hair over 0.2 long. The other one's like 0.235 long. And you can see how high the pin sticks up out of the needle. There's a difference. So if you go with that longer spring, I'm not sure it's the correct spring for these 3ACs, because most of the needles I have in my collection over here, all the carbs I've taken apart, have the short spring. And I've noticed that you have to adjust the float severely in order to use that long spring. So kind of question that whole setup. All the kits seem to come with that longer spring these days. There's the two different springs. The one on the right sticks up higher than the one on the left and has a little more tension on it, causing me to have to adjust the float. So on these new kits, I use my old springs, the shorter ones, a little over 0.2 long. When you adjust the float, don't bend this piece here. Stick a pin in here and bend this whole thing so the pivot point is right here. So you get the adjustment for this clearance or for the clearance between here and the ungasketed top of the carburetor. It should be 9/32, 0.28. On the right side of the thing, I'm just right at it. So I'm just going to let it go at that. Here it shows one where I can pass a 1/4-inch drill bit between the space between the bump on that float and the gasket. The gasket's a 32nd thick, so if you use a 1/4-inch shank of a drill bit with the gasket on, you can set it. Otherwise, if there's no gasket, you want to set it at 0.28. Now for the next adjustment, there's a little tab here you bend to get this gap between the top of the needle plunger and the tab there on the float. And you have to take that little spring clip off temporarily to get this measurement and set and adjust. So I'm going to do that next. So now with that all the way up, there's supposed to be a gap in there of, what was it? 0.070. Yeah, no, I'm looking in there and I got no gap at all. So I need to bend this little thing right here, push it in a little bit so when it hits this, it allows more travel on the float. And I can do that without taking all that off. Okay, now when it goes up about that far, and getting what just eyeballing in there. I think there's enough gap. Now before you install the float permanently, put the gasket on first. You can't get the gasket on with the float in there, so I'm going to just lay it on there and then install the float. Well, before you install the plunger on top of the carburetor, you're supposed to oil it up. Actually, you're supposed to let it soak for a few minutes with oil on it. What you're going to do is we're going to push the plunger down in that rubber boot. And installed like that. And when we go to put this thing on, there's going to be a spring underneath that plunger. Don't want to forget to put that in there. Pretty important. And that'll sit in the carburetor. Okay, now it's time to install this aluminum piston, that spring underneath it. But first the ball bearing goes in, then the spring, then the plunger. And it drops into that hole in the center of the picture, just this side of the bigger hole there. The ball bearing, it drops in that hole, is 0.155 diameter. You can see the plunger kind of poking up there. And then the spring is just a little over 1 inch long, drops in the accelerator pump hole. Now when we go to put this cover on, there's a little rubber thing that goes on top of that plunger. Okay, it's just this little black piece that goes on top of that, and when you push down on it, it should be flush. Okay, when I go to put the top on, in order to hold that plunger down, stick a thin feeler gauge. And I set it there, and I hold that feeler gauge out here to hold that piston down while I'm setting the top on, and then I pull the feeler gauge out after I get the top on. And everything's ready to go. Set that top on. Okay, when you hold the feeler gauge, you pretty much have to come in from this direction with it, about like that, because you got to clear that hole there, because this goes into it, and obviously this plunger goes into this hole, so you can't be in that area. And then this, make sure you got it down so it drops down through here, and then make sure this is horizontal. Okay, the first two screws you want to put in are this one and this one, because they're the only two that don't have something else attached to them, I believe, like a clip or something. That one might not have one. Okay, this screw with that shield goes here like that. This one with the clip on it goes back there. This one with that thing goes here. This one goes over here. That one goes there. This one with the number goes there. This one with this clip. Goes here. And then here, looks like we got just a plain old. And last but not least, plain screw there. And really don't even need this clip, it's just to hold wires, but we'll put it in there. Okay, I'm going to tighten all those down. Okay, all those screws are tightened down. You kind of go around back and forth, tightening them a little, so you tighten them all down evenly. Instead of, you don't want to tighten one side down real tight and then go to the other side and do it. You want to work back and forth, zigzag around. Now you want to pop this arm in and put the little spring clip that goes on the end. And over on this side, this arm right here has to snap in its little spot down there. You can see that little green thing, that's where it goes, right in there. So we'll move that thing up and get that hooked up. Okay, right there in the middle of the picture, you can see I got it in there. It needs a little snap clip on the end. That's the little snap clip I'm talking about right there. And now we want to put the accelerator thing in. Stick that in the hole on the plunger. Rotate it around. And then this shoulder bolt goes in and screws into the carburetor. If this is working properly and you didn't forget to put the spring in, when you lift that up, it pops itself right back down again because it's spring loaded. So if it's not doing that, then you forgot to put the spring in. And we're going to install these next. A little plastic thing goes in that hole where my little finger's pointing. Comes up this way. The spring goes on this shaft. And that shaft goes up through there and then pins it with that pin. That's what that's going to look like when you get it installed. Okay, so there we are. Everything's back together. Hopefully it'll idle right. That's the biggest trouble with these dang carburetors is the idling. One last thing to check is when you move the throttle down, watch this cam right here. It's supposed to just touch that and start to move it as it goes by, just barely. Just barely touches it and moves it. That's all it's supposed to be. If it doesn't, then you just bend that so it's right. The last thing to install in the car would be the fuel line. It gets a gasket on each end. That's what the bolt looks like. It goes right there in that hole. And the fuel line's installed. I tighten it down with a 17 millimeter. Tighten it pretty tight because that's a common spot for these things to leak. I reuse the old copper gaskets. Usually the kits come with new paper ones. Now it's ready to go in the car. Well, this carburetor idles around 900 to 1200 RPM. And I can't get it down. I've checked all the hoses, checked pretty much anything for a vacuum leak. I can't find anything. And so I rebuilt a carburetor and I'm going to replace this one, see if it makes a difference. So you can see I marked some of the hoses with color codes so I can get them in the right spot again. There's only 4 bolts that hold the carburetor on. You have to remove this, throttle cable, pull the gas line off of the gas pump, disconnect a few vacuum hoses, disconnect that, a few vacuum lines here, take those 4 nuts out. When I do those nuts, I use an 6-inch extension, 3/8. The thin one is best, but they all work, and a 12mm socket. And I take some non-hardening gasket compound, I put it inside the socket, so when I stick it over the nut sticks to it, and when I pull the thing up, the nut stays in the socket. And it also works the same way for reinstalling it. Put a little bit of that gasket compound on the nut, and then it'll stay inside the socket as you lower it down in to screw the things in. Okay, take the hoses off first. Sometimes the hoses are stuck. If you pull on them and you can't get them free because they're stuck on there really good, you know, your temptation is just to yarf it a little harder. But if you just take a pair of pliers, squeeze them and just work it back and forth a little bit, it'll come right off. Okay, 2 open end, 12mm, get that loose. Just loosen this side only, leave that one where it is, that way we can get it back in the same spot. Everything gets freed up, disconnected the plug, everything's ready. Okay, 6-inch extension. I use a thin one, I like it. Thick one will work. I put a little bit of gasket compound, non-hardening on it to capture the nut so I don't have to go fishing for it. Okay, there's one stud down through there. One down here. Here. Here, both have been removed. All 4 have been removed. We can pry this sheet metal thing up just a little bit, and we can lift the carburetor out from underneath it. It's the type of gasket that came off. There's the resin plate. I'll pull that off too and check the gasket underneath it, and maybe the metal plate too. Might as well check underneath it. Make sure I got a good seal so I don't have an air leak in there. Yeah, I'll put a new gasket. I pull this metal shield off too, put a new gasket underneath it. So the gasket goes underneath that. So we'll go clean off the old gaskets and get this ready to go. Okay, these are the 3 gaskets I'm going to use. Put that one on there. Put the aluminum plate over the top of it, and this one goes down, and this goes over the top of it, and this one is the one that goes on the base of the carburetor. And I'm going to goop up with non-hardening gasket compound. An old tube of it here. I think I got enough in there. Gooped up, ready to go. Okay, ready for the carburetor. Okay, it's all hooked up. Splice these wires back together. The hoses are hooked up. It's ready to start.